This Formula One racing car represents the very best engineering in motor racing today, and it's British. Britain is now the world leader in Formula One design, but it wasn't always that way.
British cars were very much at the back of the grid.
This is the story of how a small group of enthusiasts tinkering on home-built cars helped catapult Britain onto the Formula One grid.
The new car was virtually built by a complete band of amateurs.
We had car parts all over the place, under the bed, in the kitchen.
We've tracked down the amateur mechanics who in the 1960s had the gall to take on Europe's elite teams, giants like Ferrari. They came up with a design that rewrote the rulebook and helped drive Britain to total domination of Formula One. In the early 1950s, the glittering world of Formula One motor racing was dominated by wealthy European teams like Mercedes, Maserati, and the Italian giants Ferrari. While our continental cousins were busy battling it out for pole position, the British were struggling even to make the starting grid.
Britain was nowhere, frankly. One or two British drivers, had foreign cars, but really, the Continentals were dominating everything.
We were poor relations in the whole scene, and the scene was dominated by Italy, and we, at that time, were going nowhere.
We had drivers, but we didn't have the cars themselves. There was no motor racing industry in Britain as there is today.
Britain's failure on the professional racetrack was a national embarrassment. But race enthusiasts around the UK were desperate to fight back.
There was tremendous determination that whatever it took, somehow we got to beat these darn foreigners.
And the people who would beat those darn foreigners were an unlikely lot. The seeds of change were taking root, but a long way from Britain's existing Formula One teams. Here we go. It was amateur motor racing that would transform Britain's prospects. A sport made up of weekend enthusiasts with plenty of passion, but next to no money.
They started to think, well, I can't afford a racing car, but maybe I could build one.
Amateur racing was all about home-built cars competing on disused airfields. One of the first amateur racing clubs was called the 750 Club.
It was a club that was directed at the impecunious enthusiast. For me, it was the only type of motor racing that I would ever be able to afford to indulge in.
Members of the 750 Club were everyday folk, hard-up enthusiasts with a passion for building nippy little racers on a shoestring budget.
You could take all the pieces from a scrapyard back to your garage. 30 shillings was changing hands in cash, and in a very short time, have a chassis sitting on wheels. To do that with the Formula One, nowadays, you need a team of 300 people.
They were having to make every penny work, frankly. There were no frills.
The first racing car that I built in the front room of my home. We had car parts all over the place. Basically, I was sort of learning as I went along.
But this low-tech world of the 750 Club was to become the launchpad for an amateur who would put Britain back on the map of professional motor racing. A charismatic engineer working for British Aluminium called Colin Chapman.
Colin was an upstart who was obviously going to be successful.
Chapman has been described by others as a flawed genius.
He struck me as being a very intelligent man with some very revolutionary ideas.
The late Colin Chapman's home-built racing cars would take the amateur 750 Club by storm. His cars were far faster than the opposition because of one thing: his radical new designs. Like everyone else, Chapman always started with the same basic equation. Get rid of the weight and up the power. So off went the heavy steel body and in went a highly tuned engine. So far, pretty much what the opposition were doing. But then Chapman did something that would make his name. He started making the chassis stiffer and altering the suspension. What emerged from his lockup in North London was a very different beast indeed. He named it the Lotus Mark III.
It was the car that everyone wanted to beat. It was so much in advance of the opposition.
It did stamp Colin as a cut above the average car designer and engineer.
Chapman was showing early signs of his prodigious talent to build fast cars. But his obsession with speed at all costs meant every car he built had one alarming downside.
They would achieve what was necessary and only what was necessary, which was to win every race. And if they fell apart after they'd won the race, so be it.
He was very well known for his very light cars having sometimes rather serious failures.
What do you mean by failures, Mike?
Oh, small things like wheels coming off mainly.
But trivial matters like wheels coming off weren't going to stop this young upstart from going places. At least not yet. Chapman had a bigger dream that was to take him far beyond this lockup where he built his first car. Like some of his contemporaries in club racing, Chapman wanted to end the European team's domination of Formula One. With the success of the Lotus Mark III, he found a way to finance that ambition. From these stables in North London, Chapman started producing the Lotus Mark III in bulk. It was a humble beginning, but from it, Lotus Engineering was born. As the 50s passed by, the Lotus team quickly grew. This small workshop began to turn out popular road cars, and they used the profits to fund their moves up through the lower leagues of motor racing towards the glamorous and expensive world of Formula One. But whereas elite teams like Ferrari could afford the best mechanics in Europe, Chapman could not. So he turned to his old friends in the 750 Club and enticed them to sign up to his Lotus dream.
He could talk the birds from the trees. That was his forte.
He had a tap that he could turn on and off, and it was marked charm. So when he wanted something from you, he could be very, very charming. Chapman's newly recruited team took 6 years to develop their first Formula One car. But finally, in 1958, Lotus was ready to make the leap from the lower racing leagues into the professional world of Formula One. But Formula One was like a different universe. The highly tuned Ferraris and Maseratis were a far cry from the home-built bangers the Lotus engineers had cut their teeth on. They had a lot to prove.
Oh, I think they thought we were a bit of a circus, really. We were coming along and we were fairly disorganised. You have to remember, we were very amateur, and they'd been around a long time, and they used to turn up with nice transporters and all the latest kit, and we used to turn up with little kit and always borrowing things off other teams.
There was a certain amount of resentment, not least from Enzo Ferrari. He referred to the British teams as the garagistes.
Garagistes, mere garage mechanics. And in their first Formula One season, their new nickname was highly apt. Lotus didn't win a single race, and worse still, they failed to finish over half of them. Their transition into Formula One was not going well.
Well, they weren't really ready to go motor racing in Formula One, so it was just a disaster from beginning to end.
The car was unreliable, basically, and let the drivers down. Chapman, I'm sure, realised that he had to take out a clean sheet of paper.
It was back to the drawing board for the team of Lotus engineers. For the next 3 years, they struggled against Formula One's foreign stars. But their fortunes were about to change, thanks to a single moment of engineering genius from the Lotus boss. Chapman came up with an audacious and highly risky idea. he would gamble the team's racing fortunes on a totally new design, completely reinventing the Formula One racing car. And changing the world of Formula One forever. By the 1960s, a small team of British engineers had just a toehold in the glamorous world of Formula One. Lotus was struggling to compete against Europe's elite, teams like Mercedes and Ferrari. But the British engineers were about to make a breakthrough that would catapult Lotus to the front of the Formula One grid. On an autumn day in 1961, Mike Costin and Colin Chapman left the Lotus factory here and went down the road to a local cafe for a lunch that was to change the world of Formula One forever. Chapman's latest idea was a radical new car called the Lotus 25.
Colin was well known for his expertise in doing simple drawings beautifully. He got a table napkin and drew the basis of the Lotus 25 design, and I immediately saw that it was the way to go.
Chapman had come up with an amazing new idea that was about to change Formula One forever. His revolutionary design was all to do with the chassis of the car. Until then, racing cars were built a bit like me. The designers would start off with a basic skeleton, known as a space frame, onto which all of the important bits would be attached, then covered over with an aerodynamic skin. But Chapman's radical idea was to do away with the racing car's skeleton altogether, and instead design the aerodynamic outer skin so that it was one rigid outer unit, strong enough for all the other important bits to be bolted onto it. This was called a monocoque chassis. Not only was the chassis lighter and simpler than the old space frame chassis, meaning more speed, but there was also another benefit. When a car is travelling at high speed, there are huge forces running through the structure. Hit a bend, and these forces go off the scale. In the old space frame cars, the skeleton would flex, and the tires would tilt, making them lose some of their contact with the road. The idea was that the new Lotus 25, with its incredibly stiff monocoque chassis, should hardly flex at all, meaning more rubber on the road, more grip, and with a bit of luck, more speed. The revolutionary Lotus 25 would be a giant step forward if the engineers could turn the ambitious design into a reality. But it was already November 1961, and they had just 6 months until the first race of the '62 season, when once again they'd face the fearsome power of the Ferraris. They had to get the untested technology behind their brand new car working, and in record time.
Building the 25 was quite difficult because it was all new. We had to keep on coming up with new ideas to cope with new problems. It was developing the tools to even make the chassis, let alone make the chassis.
Lotus's Formula One dream now rested on this one unproven design. But could the engineers make it work? After 6 long months and many late nights, the new car was finally ready. But secrecy and the lack of time and money meant that the team couldn't test it. Nobody really had any idea if the car was raceable at all.
We didn't know how it was going to go because you design the car as the best way you know how, but until you actually run it, you don't know whether it's any good or not.
The first time the Lotus 25 would hit the track would be at the Dutch Grand Prix, the first race of the 1962 season. In late May, at the Zandvoort circuit in Holland, the months of secrecy came to an end. The covers were finally removed, and the new car emerged into the light. It created quite a stir.
Out of the transporter suddenly comes the Lotus 25, and you suddenly realise, my godfather, this is an entirely different concept.
It must have been quite an exciting moment when you first turned up.
Oh yes, very exciting, because we were showing something to the world they hadn't seen before, and therefore everybody was very interested in what you'd achieved.
With the bodywork on, sitting on the grid, the car looked $1 million.
The sleek new Lotus was the lightest car on the grid. If our heroes had got it right, its monocoque chassis should handle the twisting track far better than even the mighty Ferraris. But the question was, would it? At midday on Saturday the 20th of May 1962, the Lotus 25, now paired with its legendary driver Jim Clark, had earned a very respectable third place on the starting grid. Further back, starting ninth, was the fearsome Ferrari Sharknose, the Italian entry that had cruised to victory the previous year. It was time for the acid test. Would the huge gamble that Lotus had taken pay off, or would it end in disaster?
The one thing, of course, at the back of everybody's mind, when a new car comes out, there are teething troubles with even the best cars. And it was sort of fingers crossed time, really.
The support teams withdrew, the lights changed, and driver Jim Clark put his foot to the floor. Unleashing 195 brake horsepower, he catapulted the car forward at 180 miles an hour and straight into the lead on its very first Grand Prix lap. The Lotus stretched its lead, and by the 11th lap, it was almost half a minute ahead of its nearest rival.
We were in the lead, which was what we'd all hoped for, of course, but then we saw we could achieve it. That was very exciting for everybody.
But on lap 70, just 10 laps from the checkered flag, disaster struck. The clutch started to stick, leaving Clark struggling with the gears. He had no choice but to come into the pits. Clark was stuck in the pits for minutes while the mechanics frantically tried to fix his car. When he finally emerged, he was last, and that's where he stayed for the rest of the race. It wasn't the kind of start that Lotus had been hoping for. The Lotus 25 had shown signs of real brilliance, but the brilliance was brittle. Chapman's revolutionary monocoque car was lightning fast, but also highly unreliable. It was the start of an erratic season. The car won 3 races, but failed to finish 3 others. But despite this unreliability, by the final race of the 1962 season, Lotus was still in contention for the Formula One crown. It would all come down to one final race. Everything would hinge on the South African Grand Prix. If Clark could win this race, their car would take the World Championships at its very first attempt. This time, Clark was in pole position. He started in front, and he stayed in front. It was the dream start for the little Lotus team, but would their car hold out?
We checked everything about 5 times around the car, and we'd been over it and over it and over it.
With 3/4 of the race completed, Clark was roaring ahead.
Well, he went out and led from the start from pole position. He built up a lead of about half a minute. He was just cruising to victory.
We were doing everything right until the moment when it all went horribly wrong for us.
Suddenly, on lap 62, minutes from victory, disaster. A tiny part of the engine sheared, and the car's entire oil supply spilled on the track. Clark's race was over. The car's lack of reliability had cost them the championship. It was a cruel blow for the Lotus engineers.
That was exceedingly disappointing for everybody. It actually takes you about a week to realise that it's happened to you, that you've lost the championship at the last hurdle.
The Lotus 25, with its monocoque chassis, had proved capable of winning races, but the real key to winning the Formula One crown was reliability, the one thing the Lotus 25 did not have. It was a major worry for the Lotus garagistes, who needed to win to keep their dream alive.
The difference between winning and complete failure at a race could be fairly catastrophic financially, because prize money in those days was a significant component of the total income of a team.
If they were to survive another season in the top flight, the team of engineers had to radically improve their car's reliability. They began the arduous job of picking every little detail of the Lotus 25 apart. and improving every spring, cog and bolt. It was a massive job.
I worked all hours God send, 14-hour days, 7-day weeks. It was all the same to me.
It was very hard work. Chapman was a real taskmaster. You really worked at least 6 days a week, if not 7, and you worked from 8 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night most times. So you needed to be young and enjoy what you were doing.
After a long winter, the brand new Lotus 25 was trimmed, tidied, and ready for the 1963 season. But would the new, improved car have what it took to fulfill the garagistes' lifelong dream and win the Formula One crown? Right from the start, it was clear the new Lotus was a very different beast.
The car was much more reliable, and it became the car to beat during that season.
With the legendary Jim Clark in the driver's seat, the car won 7 out of the year's 10 Grand Prix, usually minutes in front of its nearest rival.
The Lotus 25 had found its form, and it proved to be almost unbeatable. On the 28th of December 1963, the South African Grand Prix, Clark whistled past the checkered flag to claim his record-breaking 7th victory. The Formula One World Championship that the team had longed for had finally arrived.
The Lotus 25 was a car that changed everything. By introducing their new revolutionary monocoque chassis, this team of engineers set a new standard for their sport. And today, every car on the Formula One grid uses Chapman's ingenious monocoque design.
The boys who started out with no money, making homemade racing cars in lock-up garages, laid the foundations for a British industry that is today worth £5 billion a year. Enzo Ferrari had famously dismissed them all as garagistes, mere garage mechanics. But actually, it was our backroom heroes who had the last laugh.
Britons are making 1.2 billion train journeys a year, more than ever before.
But 50 years ago, Britain's railways were in a real mess, and people were deserting them in their millions.
Then 2 visionary engineers imagined a tilting train that could run twice as fast as anything on our rails.
Well, we tracked down these 2 pioneers who dreamt of saving Britain's railways by building a train capable of doing over 150 miles an hour on Britain's twisting rail system.
1 or 2 people felt we were a lot of upstarts.
The difficulty was with people not believing that it could be done. They just simply say it's a load of rubbish.
It's just one of those iconic pieces of British engineering. We'd never seen anything like it.
This is the story of 2 maverick engineers and their space-age tilting train that was so ahead of its time that it brought Britain's railways to a grinding halt.
In the 1960s, Britain's railways were under threat. Trains were no match for increasingly affordable air travel and the speed and convenience of motorways.
At the time, trains were averaging just 60 miles an hour. To survive, British Rail had to increase speeds and make journey times shorter.
It was quite obvious to the British Rail Board and to the government that the future of the railways was about speed.
But in the 60s, high speeds were a pipe dream for British Rail. Post-war France and Japan spent billions laying dead straight track for their new high-speed trains. But Britain was stuck with 20,000 miles of snaking railways.
We had the problem that nobody else had. We had a railway with corners, and trains definitely don't like corners.
In a desperate bid for fresh ideas, in 1962, tired old British Rail created a radical new research department. But to the disgust of British Rail's own engineers, they recruited people with no experience of the railways at all. This new department was headed by a 30-year-old firebrand called Alan Wickins, a man who'd cut his teeth on planes and missiles and who knew absolutely nothing about trains.
The reason that I was recruited was certainly the fact that I was a fresh mind with no preconceived notions of existing railway technology.
Nice to meet you, Mike.
Alan soon recruited another outsider, Mike Newman, an engineer from the National Coal Board, who'd barely ridden a train, let alone designed one.
I recognised that I was joining a team of research engineers who knew what they were doing, and they had some great ideas which I thought were groundbreaking.
British Rail's hopes were resting on the shoulders of Alan and his team of outsiders. Their task was to design a train that could run at high speed on our curved railways.
For every 1 mile an hour increase in average speed, you got 1% more revenue. Speed was the way forward.
But with speed came danger. If a train hit a curve too fast, powerful centrifugal forces made it impossible for customers to stay in their seats.
If a conventional train hit a sharp curve at very high speed, people would be flung all over the place.
Alan's team wrestled with the problem of passenger comfort for months. Finally, a solution was found in the way a motorbike whizzes round bends by tilting.
A motorcyclist, as he goes around a curve, naturally balances the centrifugal forces and does so by leaning.
The answer to British Rail's crippling problems was a train that could imitate how a motorbike takes corners at speed.
The solution to travelling fast on curved railways was the tilting train, because the passenger would not feel the full effect of the lateral acceleration, rather like a motorcycle rider in a curve.
Alan recognised making an existing train tilt wouldn't be enough. His team of outsiders had to create the single most advanced rail vehicle in the world, where every component was an innovation.
Better braking,
Better steering,
different power systems,
lightweight.
the whole train, not just simply the one item of a tilting train.
They proposed a revolutionary locomotive that would top an incredible 150 miles an hour, faster than any British train had ever been before.
Alan knew the design for the tilting mechanism would be the key to success, and he created the world's first powered tilting system, using 2 rows of hydraulic jacks positioned under the train's carriage. They would lift one side of the train as it entered a curve. Alan worked out the perfect tilt was 9 degrees, just enough to displace the centrifugal forces and keep passengers comfortable. But Alan's design caused uproar. British Rail did have the courage to employ cutting-edge scientists, but they ran scared of pinning their future strategy on their radical ideas.
The ideas of tilting were not taken seriously by the railway.
I remember being challenged at a talk at the Institution of Mechanical Engineers by being told that what I was saying was rubbish.
The engineering side of the railways was very conservative.
They took science into the railway where the railway didn't want science. I mean, it was a clash, a complete clash of ideologies.
Dismissing the establishment's lack of foresight, Alan's team spent the next 3 years completing their design on paper. But to turn it into a working prototype, they'd need serious cash, £5 million, and British Rail's pockets were already empty.
You've got to remember, British Railways was in a parlous financial situation at this stage, making huge losses.
I guess at the time, when you're a fairly young man and you see your career ahead of you and it seems to be going nowhere, standing with a begging bowl for a couple of years seems to be a very long time.
By 1967, Alan and his team were still desperate for funds when their research department had a visit from an ambitious Tory MP.
One of these visitors that we had was Margaret Thatcher.
I was very impressed, I must say. I think very keen mind.
She waved away the entourage who wanted to try to move her on to the next presentation. She just wanted everything out of me that she could, and she pummeled me, seeking more information out of me about the economics of the railways.
It's not known whether Margaret Thatcher brought any direct pressure on the money men, but finally, in 1969, Alan and Mike were given the green light, enough funding to build their tilting train.
You don't have time to start opening champagne bottles. You've got to start getting to work and produce a train.
Their first cheque was spent building specialist workshops in Derby, soon to be filled with 150 contract engineers. The chief technical officer came from the motor industry, hard-working Kit Spackman.
At one stage, the Advanced Projects Division had the highest ratio of failed marriages in the whole of BR. It doesn't surprise me, really, because we were working the most silly hours.
There were no half measures for British Rail. With millions invested, they told the world about their glittering new project.
British Rail was saying that this was the cornerstone of their policy. They envisaged that about 60 of these trains would be whizzing up and down the West Coast Main Line, and they really had tremendous hopes placed in it.
Under extraordinary pressure, Alan's team of outsiders began to build the world's most advanced passenger train.
The tilting system was entirely automatic. Jacks pushed the vehicle into the rolled position. They were operated by a control system which was picking up the lateral acceleration felt on the vehicle as it went round the curve.
The area that I worked in specifically was the entire tilt system, which needed a fair amount of expertise, and probably more than I had to start with, but in that sort of environment you learnt very quickly. One of the things that we had to do was work out which way round the accelerometers had to go, because if it was the wrong way round, the train would not just tilt the wrong way, it would fall over, and it did, more than once.
Traditionally, trains were made of steel, but this was far too heavy if the train was to tilt. So Alan dared to use a lightweight metal used for years to build aeroplanes: aluminium.
Well, aluminium was the natural choice, having had experience in the aircraft industry. It has the highest strength-weight ratio.
So you had this unique situation where the railway suddenly went into the aero industry, and that was a first.
By 1971, all these innovations had been rolled into a super train years ahead of its time.
And this is it, the Advanced Passenger Train Experimental. It may be confined to a museum now, but back then it was the stuff of science fiction. It was aerodynamic. It was made of lightweight aluminium. It had radical new wheels and suspension. And it could fly around corners at high speed thanks to its hydraulic tilt.
The APTE was British Rail's great hope for the future.
One felt very proud of the whole project, of course. Oh, I thought it looked marvellous.
Oh, it was like a spaceship on wheels. It'd be difficult to not be impressed by it. You got an impression of, wow, look at this, we're really doing something clever here.
The purpose of the APT, in many respects, was to show the art of the possible into the future.
Alan Wickham, without a doubt, it was a genius. We really believed the railway had arrived.
In 1972, full of confidence, the British Rail Board announced the tilting train was ready for its historic first test run.
The event should have brought the railways into a new era. Instead, it was to bring Britain to a grinding halt. In the 1970s, British rail profits were plummeting, and it had pinned its hopes on a revolutionary tilting train.
Designed by a groundbreaking research team at British Rail, the APTE was built to reach 150 miles an hour, taking bends 40% faster than any other train before it. It was meant to be British Rail's saving grace. At least, that was the theory.
The tilting train's legendary first test run took place on the 25th of July, 1972. A simple 4-mile trip from Derby to Duffield. The objective was to see how the train handled at low speed. The tilting system would be tested later.
The first run was certainly feelings of apprehension through the train.
The train's power came from 10 untried gas turbines. They'd been supplied by a new engineering company, British Leyland.
You've got to remember those turbines were experimental too, and there were difficulties.
The train managed the 4-mile trip, but only 3 of the gas turbines worked. It was clear much more development was needed.
It didn't seem particularly successful at the time, but there was a much greater disaster coming.
As soon as the test run was over, Alan and Mike received news that threatened to cripple the entire project. ASLEF, the train drivers' union, was kicking up a stink about the design of the train's cab.
In the early 70s, trains all had 2 drivers, but the APTE was built with room for only 1.
Incredibly, British Rail hadn't agreed the principle of using just a single driver with the union. ASLEF was furious that potentially half their drivers could lose their jobs, and the union announced their members were banned from ever driving the tilting train.
This was an absolute disaster. The whole project seemed to collapse, and the morale of the team fell to absolute floor level.
With the prototype needing modifications, the train was moved back to Derby by a non-union manager. ASLEF was outraged and called a national strike. Suddenly, the tilting train was responsible for bringing Britain to a halt, and it cost British Rail over £1 million.
If they'd added £1 million that cost British Rail to my project, I think we would have failed to continue.
The public perception of the project was now badly tainted, and work on the tilting train was suspended.
After the battle with the drivers' union, the APT might simply have rusted away like this, were it not for the exceptional resolve and determination of our British engineers.
After an 8-week period of nothing happening, we reorganised ourselves and the project seemed to burst into life again.
The train needed substantial repairs, and so did its tattered reputation. To capture the hearts and minds of the public, Alan hatched a plot to grab the headlines.
In a remarkable show of self-belief, the engineers aimed high at the British Rail speed record. Their attempt would be made on the 10th of August, 1975.
It was a daring move designed to silence the train's critics. With the driver's ban lifted, the team set off from Uffington Station at 10:20 a.m. The fastest a British train had ever managed before was 144 miles an hour.
I said to my colleagues, somehow or other, you've got to make it run at 150 miles an hour today, boys.
The gas turbines had been modified, and the tilt system was operating smoothly. The speed steadily increased.
The tilt system was tilting, the brakes were braking, the power turbines were giving their all, the suspension was working absolutely beautifully going around the corner.
We're 123 now.
Finally, word came down to push the train for all she was worth.
We wanted to go, obviously, as fast as the train was capable of going. Everything was absolute full power.
Just after midday, the tilting train roared into the record books with an astonishing 152.3 miles an hour.
The morale of people couldn't have been higher. One of my colleagues said, if it had gone wrong, I think we'd have pushed it.
It was a very impressive train at high speed, and even more impressive to ride in it when it was tilting.
It's just one of those iconic pieces of British engineering that at the time was so revolutionary. You can't really explain to people who now take mobile phones and computers and the internet and MySpace and YouTube for granted. You can't explain to them. This was a real train, the future of railways.
But we can reveal that the record-breaking run came perilously close to failure.
I have a little admission to make. During that test, some of the communication system failed. And we actually managed to achieve the target despite the disaster on the electronics.
Did the press discover this disaster? Or?
You're the first person to ever know.
Over the next few years, Alan and his team fine-tuned the tilting train, proving time and again that hours could be saved on long-distance routes. By 1976, the research phase was complete. It was time for Alan and Mike to say goodbye to their creation. It was now up to BR's traditional engineers to push tilting trains into production.
At this point, my responsibility for APT finished.
I handed over the project to other people and indeed even left the railways.
Alan and Mike's job was done. They delivered some of the most advanced technology in the world to British Rail. But why didn't tilting trains now take over the whole country?
In the late 70s, British Rail's in-house engineers chose to change Alan's design. The hydraulic tilt was replaced with air springs, and 3 trains were rushed into service. The big launch was on the 7th of December 1981, running from Glasgow to London Euston. On board were the first paying customers and a group of journalists keen for a story. Kit Spackman also bagged a seat.
As the sun came up and we were going around Abington Curve at the time, it was a very, very long left-hand curve. It then became apparent that the train was doing its tilting thing exactly as it was designed to do, and the horizon was going up and down, and the first instances of the dreaded tilt sickness occurred.
The winter temperatures had caused the mechanisms to freeze up, and the train's smooth tilt turned into a noticeable jerk.
The shock was when it tilted. Suddenly, the public were travelling on a train and people went, I feel sick. You're sitting drinking your coffee and then it went boom, and your coffee went over the next person sitting next to you.
Obviously, on a press run, that was disastrous. And the press coverage was adverse, to say the least.
Legend has it that the reason the press hammered the tilting train was because the night before they'd got hammered themselves with a free bar at their hotel.
Yes, I think some of the press had perhaps overindulged the night before. It did introduce what I think has become known as tilt nausea.
You know, we're starting with this new train. Did you really expect it to be perfect, 100% first time out? The press really sort of hammered BR over this.
After only 3 days, the tilting train was withdrawn from scheduled service. After years of tinkering, it was quietly reintroduced on the West Coast Main Line, but was never reliable.
In 1985, the British Rail Board finally lost patience and pulled the plug on the tilting train.
The train was put into service prematurely. It hadn't achieved the necessary state of reliability, and there were failures. The board made some very bad decisions.
A bit more application, a bit more effort here and there, and we could have had trains like that in service years and years ago. Things could have been so good.
The multi-million-pound project was deemed suitable only for scrap, and so the trains were unceremoniously torn to shreds.
What happened was it was like, get rid of it, and we never want to see it again.
But that wasn't the last time tilting trains would run on British tracks. Ironically, in 1998, we turned to Europe.
13 years after the project was closed down, Virgin Rail realised the potential of tilting technology. But with no British trains to buy, they spent £1.2 billion on a fleet of Pendolinos, Italian tilting trains from Fiat, developed using much of the technology that Wickens and Newman had created. It is a cruel and bitter irony.
I'm very sad that it isn't a British design. That is a matter of great regret.
Today, there are over 80 Italian tilting trains operating in the UK, but none of them would exist without the genius of our British engineers.